Thank you for joining us at the Winds of Change event at Duke University, where we're diving deep into the practical realities of offshore wind development. This panel will focus on leasing and permitting strategies. And also, as with the other sessions, this is being live streamed and recorded. So now I'm going to hand it off to the moderator, Kristoffer Svendsen. Chris.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, welcome to this panel. We're going to talk about leasing and permitting. And I'm Kristoffer Svendsen. I'm a senior research fellow at Tulane Law School, and where I teach offshore wind law. We have a class on it, one credit class at the law school, where we focus on this. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Stavanger in Norway, where I'm originally from, even though I'm also barred in New York and worked as an attorney a bit in the US. And with me, I have two guests. We lost one. Laura Smith Morton from Perkins Cove was supposed to be here, but she fell ill. So just want to wish her the best, and hopefully she'll get better soon. To my right is Manisha Patel, and she is the Deputy Executive Director of the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. We'll probably just call it the Permitting Council, something short. And she's been in and out of government service for a while. And then next to her again, we have Josh Robichaud, and he's an associate with Bracewell, and Bracewell is considered the premier law firm within leasing and specifically permitting when it comes to offshore wind. So thank you very much for joining me on this panel. And starting, I was planning on just saying a couple of words about leasing and permitting. First of all, I just want to recognize that, as you might have seen, that there was a proposed sale notice for upcoming lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico now recently. And the interesting thing about that lease sale, there were three areas in that proposed sale notice of a total of 300,000 acres, which equals about 1.3 million homes. And one of the interesting things was that area started out as 30 million acres, and through different consultations with the stakeholders, tribes, and other communities, it came down to what we saw that notice today, or recently, as 300,000, 100,000-ish acres being off the coast of Louisiana, and then 200,000 acres being off the coast of Texas. And we'll see how the interest for that will grow, as we have seen let's see where we are. So as we've seen when it comes to the previous lease sales, we saw that the leases outside of New York, the 6 leases there, sold for $4.37 billion. We saw the leases outside of the coast here in the Carolinas selling for $315 million. And then we saw the California leases selling for around $750 million. And now we'll see what the interest will be for the leases in the Gulf. And what's interesting about leases is that, of course, it doesn't really give you any right to do anything except for submit paperwork. And we're going to talk about that today, a lot of paperwork. And why the paperwork is important is, or the permits are important, it's similar to what you would think about when you're building a house. And I'm sure some of you have built houses and as a result of that had to pull permits and get permissions to do certain things. I built a house in New Orleans, and my contractor there told me that we could pull permits if I wanted to, but it wasn't like something that we had to do, which it's an interesting approach to it. But of course, in the offshore wind space, it's quite important
You have to do it.
to get the right permits, and it's quite a time-consuming and important process, but it's there for transparency and it's there for an orderly development of these projects. And as you can see from these pictures, you definitely want to avoid the courtroom as much as you can. And as we've seen from Cape Wind, for example, if it drags on for too long, these projects might not happen. And as we have seen from some presentations of these different lease areas, is that there's a lot of foreign companies that are involved and picking up these leases that are not necessarily coming from countries or cultures where litigation is so desired as it is in the US. But if we look at just this list of different topics, I'm just trying to show all the different areas which would require permits or different sort of environmental assessments. And as you can see on the left side, with the different areas within the offshore space, you can see marine physical process, you see marine water, et cetera, of all these different areas that has that you have to consult with or that require permits. And similarly on the onshore side, and then you have these other hard constraints that also require permitting. And the whole point of this, I'm not going to go through all of them, it's just for you guys to see this huge area and all these different issues that complicates this development, as been pointed out by the previous speakers. And as was pointed to in the previous chapter 2, this interaction of jurisdictional issues, and this drawing is just showing how you have federal jurisdiction that interacts with state jurisdictions for certain areas, and then also local jurisdiction, so that you can see that, for example, just cables can interact with several jurisdictions that Manisha might come and comment on a little bit more in detail. But an interesting picture that will show you just these different aspects, jurisdictional issues that arises on these different operations that the development goes through. And then at the end, just to complicate it even more, then you have all these different federal bodies, for example, that has to be consulted or has to give permits throughout the development. And as I pointed to in the beginning, when you pay some $100 million for a lease, that doesn't give you anything else than the ability to submit paperwork. And this site assessment plan and this construction operations plan are two examples of these quite huge packages of documents that has to be submitted and approved, which of course is wonderful for the lawyers that can then sit and bill for years before you even get to construction. But on that note, I'll pass the word to Manisha that can go a little bit more in detail on these different issues.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you, everybody, and good afternoon. When it comes to these kinds of colloquia, forum, conferences, whatever, people usually dread that spot right after lunch. What I have found is it's the spot after that spot that is just the most brutal killer 45 minutes you're gonna have to make it through. Because the one after this is the one before happy hour and everybody's like, okay, I can make it. This one is in the conference equivalent of like the horse latitudes. We're just all gonna sit here and talk about the riveting topic of permitting for a while, right? Okay. Stay with me, folks. I'm going to try to keep this lively. It is actually, I think somebody earlier was commenting on, tax law being exciting. And I realized in the moment, actually it was the former commissioner. And I realized in that moment when she said that that is what makes this industry just so much darn tootin' fun, is because everybody is just nerds out on their own little piece of it. And we all love what we do. And as I start to explain my little sliver of this, I will commend to you that we are building an industry together here. I heard the comment earlier that the wind industry is not new. And that is true. But here in the States, we are building this industry together. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today, did I just turn this off? Whoops. There we go. What I'm going to talk to you guys today about is the Federal Permitting Council and the FAST 41 statute. FAST 41 is, of course, an acronym. It, interestingly enough, isn't meant to imply anything about speed. FAST is short for Fixing America's Surface Transportation. And that was the 2015 Transportation Reauthorization Bill, Title 41 of which created the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. And I kind of, the council itself, you see all, and Chris had a few of the agencies involved in federal permitting in his previous slide. The council is made up of 13 agencies. The deputy secretary level or higher person is the designate on the council. So 13 federal agencies, plus the director of the Office of Management and Budget, the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, and then a presidentially appointed executive director. That's my boss. She is sorry that she couldn't join you here today. Her name is Christine Harada, and if you ever have the good fortune of running into her or meeting her, by all means, take that opportunity. She's an amazing person. So I will say, when I look at this slide and when I start talking to large groups of folks like this about what the Permitting Council is and what we do, it occurs to me we might be the punchline to a terrible joke. Something along the lines of how many federal agencies does it take to permit an offshore wind facility, right? But it's true. And all I'm going to say on behalf of the executive branch at this point is it ain't us. The reason it looks like this is because over the years, through accretion of statutes, Congress has created a number of different statutory mechanisms and schemes, all of which are important in their own right. But it does create a very Byzantine federal landscape when you're trying to permit an offshore wind facility, and then the transmission that goes along with it to get the electrons to where they need to be. So in a nutshell, what is FAST 41? Well, it was Congress's attempt to reconcile the fact that they saw that the federal permitting process really was just kind of all over the place. And so, like I said, the FAST Act was passed in 2015. When it was originally passed in Title 41 and the Permitting Council was created, it was created with the sunset. In November of 2021, with the bipartisan infrastructure law, the agency became permanent. We were given a few additional authorities. And then the real kabowie whammy thing that happened to us was last August under the Inflation Reduction Act. Congress gave us $350 million to distribute to the betterment of improving the federal permitting process. And the nice thing about our statute, one of the powers that the executive director has is, unlike many other agencies, I'm going to get a little nerdy and wonky here for a second, but unlike most federal agencies, our annual appropriations, so not the IRA money, but the federal appropriations we generally get every year, which up until we got the 350 million was about 10 million a year we get. Those are know-your monies. And there's a lot of latitude. And so one of the things we have, one of the powers that the executive director has is really to address the question of resources. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But in a nutshell, even though of all the audiences in the world, I bet I could get into chapter and verse and comma and semicolon on the statutory text, I'm going to break it down to you this way. The statute exists to bring predictability, and transparency and accountability to the federal permitting process through quick issue resolution and forced coordination and collaboration amongst all the different players. And how does it do that? Well, quite simply put, I'm going to actually skip around here for a second because I think it's easier to see it than to say it. And I probably switched right past it. See, this is how I keep you guys interested and awake. What is she doing with those slides? There we go. All right, this is how it's done. First of all, and we've seen this, right? The benefits of what the FAST 41 statute does is it brings a very clearly articulated process that forces agencies to come together at the beginning of a permitting process to talk through what all the different permits and authorizations are, and to put that all on a giant Gantt chart, like a timeline, right? And it's actually, that is the term of art in the statute. It's called the permitting timetable. And that's developed collectively with all of the agencies under what's called a coordinated project plan. What we have seen is that the process that the statute demands for all the agencies to come together and to work together, it has a way of really making leadership, both political and career at the federal agencies, pay attention. That drives resource allocation. It prioritizes things. Beyond that, the use of the FAST 41 statute for projects has, I think, across the federal government, really brought together kind of an alignment and a thinking around sort of how are we going to scope this out? What's the design plan for the permitting? I sit up here and every time I give this presentation, which is not infrequently actually, this is the point where I get embarrassed because yes, we needed a statute to make the agencies do that. Like you would think that the agencies would come together but they're, again, executive branch agencies are mission driven. They have their own statutes and they do what their statutes tell them to. And there is no single statute short of FAST 41 that says, hey, get together and play together and work through issuing a permit, right? And so that's really where it's great. And in doing so, and what we've done, and one of the things, as a practical matter, all of this is implemented through a federal dashboard. It's a website. I'm going to get to that in the next slide. But it brings sunlight to the whole process, because that's the other thing that Congress had heard prior to the enactment of FAST 41 was that, you know, a project sponsor would fill their application out, send it in, and then they didn't know where it went, didn't know who was working on it, didn't know whether they needed to give any more information or not. This process actually shines light on that. That's the transparency piece of it. So I think there's a lot of value to becoming a covered project. And so this is the dashboard, as I was telling you. When you go to permitting.gov, pretty straightforward, permitting.gov, you will see a project page for each covered project. And on that page, you will see very clearly who are the agencies that are involved in permitting it. And then if you scroll down and you click further, you'll see this Gantt chart, the permitting timetable that lays out. And I appreciate, you know, for those of you all the way in the back row, you can't see this. I know, sorry. If you go to the website, you'll see it very clearly. I'm not sure what the plans are for distributing these, but you can find me on the internet too. And anyone from my agency would happily share these slides with you because we're a federal agency. We're here to help. So along that left-hand column, what you're going to see are all the statutes and permits that are required. And then across it is the timeline for each milestone, right? So for example, when someone says, hey, you're going to need a Section 404 Clean Water Act permit from the Army Corps of Engineers for that. Sounds like that's one thing you need. No, 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 no. As you go through that process, to get that permit, you're probably going to need to do some delineation of wetlands. You're going to have to start a NEPA process. That has at least 6 stages in it. I mean, there are milestones along the way. And I heard someone earlier today talking about the time, actually, maybe several people talking about the timeline for federal permits. And it's necessarily long enough to make sure that it gives time to consider that whole panoply of list of things that Sven put up, right? There's so many things to consider. So you have to give enough time for that. I think where the frustration in the process comes is when there's just sort of what feels like an interminable back and forth, or things kind of get lost because nobody knows what the answer is and it's just sitting there because we don't know where it went. This is, again, where the Fast 41 process is extremely helpful, because if you're a covered project, then what happens is you file what's called a FIN. It's a Fast Act Initiation Notice. Essentially, it's a form that says, here's our project, here's our financial viability, here's the scope of it, here's where we plan to be, here are the permits we plan on anticipate having. It's pretty straightforward, and all of that, again, defined in statute on what you have to submit. But once that's submitted, we, the federal family, have 14 days to make a determination of whether the project can be covered under the statute. Once that determination is made and it's posted to that website, then we have only 60 days to come up with that coordinated project plan and project timeline. And within that 60 days, the lead agency has to identify everybody else that needs to be at the table in 21 days. So from a federal permitting, for those of you familiar with the process already, these are pretty quick. These are calendar days, by the way. This is a pretty fast thing. And it really is these last 2 steps, that coordinated project plan and that timetable, that drive this. And all of this works because the permitting council executive director is required to report quarterly to Congress. And then also we do an annual report, but quarterly, on how well agencies are doing in meeting these statutory requirements. So there's a real action forcing mechanism. I talked to you about the $350 million that we got under the Inflation Reduction Act, and our expanded authorities under the bipartisan infrastructure law. I will say that the executive director's ability, the funding we have on hand, and our ability to transfer that quickly to meet the resources and the resource needs may be one of the most valuable and powerful aspects of the statute, because it really goes to the heart of the issue, right? You got to get the work done. There are at this point 16 sectors and growing that fall under the statute's purview. Rest assured, renewable energy production is one of them. Slide is there because this is a standard deck. The project criteria that have to be demonstrated to be a covered project, in a nutshell, again, I appreciate you can't read this slide. It's really meant for like a handout thing, but I put it in here anticipating that we will share this with you. In a nutshell, to be a covered project, you have to be subject to NEPA. It has to be something that costs $200 million or more, the project does. And it can't be part of some already established accelerated environmental review process. There are very few of those, but there are some that exist. And that's it. And so, again, I'm not going to belabor the criteria because offshore wind is definitely covered. There are a couple of things that I think are worth noting, and some sort of persistent, I'm going to call, I call them myths here on the slide, but the process is not meant or intended to cut corners or reduce the quality of projects by any stretch of the imagination. It really is about coordination and a routinization, right? This is sort of putting the process on a path to make it keep going. The statute also doesn't dictate particular outcomes. It's not a substantive thing. It doesn't make the actual call on whether something is going to have a significant impact or not. It doesn't prescribe deadlines. Those are set by the team or by the agencies. So I think I'm going to wrap it up so that Josh has enough time. The statute also lays out very clearly what you need to do to become a Fast 41 project. And then my slides actually have a few extra things that you can like read through. So that's what you need to know right there. Permitting.gov. Everything I said is on that website. I am going to tee up a couple of questions to pass it over to Josh here. Only insofar as I talked about the fact that, you know, we're building an industry together. And the Fast 41 statute, I think, is a very powerful tool to help the federal family play together nicely and move things along. But at the end of the day, the real challenge for those of us within the federal government, state government, local government, tribes, which, by the way, not stakeholders, they are their own independent government, sovereign government, right? So we often fall into the trap of talking about tribes lumped together in a group of other stakeholders, but they are their own governmental entity, sovereign entity. The challenge for all of us at every one of those levels is about changing culture. It's about changing the way we think about things. For so many decades in our country, we have approached environmental review and authorization and permitting in the standpoint of don't build, right? I love that acronym, NOPE. We are at an inflection point, right? We must build. If we are going to save our planet, we need to build. And how do we build in a way, how do we build for the future in a way that really does balance all of the different equities that we need? And so it's in that, I think that's really where the juice is. And so speaking of the juice and getting the juice on land, I will pass it over to Josh. Oh, sorry, it's not passing.
Thank you, Manisha. Thank you, Chris, for putting the panel together, and Duke for bringing us all to have these important conversations. In terms of my perspective coming to this, I'm in private practice and I work with a lot of offshore wind developers in terms of bidding projects into state solicitations, working through the permitting process and all the ins and outs of that, and just generally keeping projects online and making sure that they're not only in the near term complying with what they need to keep pushing a project forward, but thinking ahead and making sure that they're planning in such a way that they're able to achieve these projects. So from that perspective, I was going to approach this from some observations of the practical tensions of developing a project in this permitting scheme. And it's come up on the last few panels. I wanted to do that through a lens, the approach of transmission, and specifically transmission planning and getting the actual production onshore. To borrow a turn of phrase from Manisha when we were doing some of our planning, rather than where the rubber meets the road, where the cable meets the land, the beach. So the royalties to Manisha on that wonderful turn of phrase. So before I get you there, I just want to do a little bit of brief level setting. If permitting is already causing people's eyes to glass over, the interconnection process is probably going to be a non-habit forming sleep aid. But just very briefly, stick with me here. You have a generator. You're able to in this case, put wind turbines in the water. They're able to spin, produce electrons. You need to get those to shore, A, for that generator to make money, and B, for it to actually be useful. To do that, you need to interconnect the project. We have our existing onshore grid. That grid has been mainly built to get large centralized generation located at various points around the country out. And just because of how that's developed, it's mostly from inland to the shore. And that is becoming a limitation when you're now trying to work the other way, and those large inputs of electricity are coming in at the shore. That's the sort of furthest out branches of the system. So it requires a lot of planning to make sure that you're able to do that safely and reliably, and a lot of land and coordination to get the permits you need and everything in order to actually be able to do that. And all of that obviously comes with cost. So the entity that runs that interconnection process is a RTO, regional transmission operator, or ISO, independent system operator. There's a variety of them across the country. For at least where we're sitting today, the relevant one would be PJM, the PJM interconnection. So they handle this interconnection process. The first step is you submit your interconnection request. You go through a couple steps in terms of proving that you are actually developing a project and checking a couple boxes. That then goes into a study process. You're grouped in with other facilities that are going to be interconnecting in the same area around the same time. And we figure out you need X amount of upgrades to the network in order to be able to do that interconnection. Those costs are allocated amongst that whole group. And then we move on to actually building those power lines, transformers, whatever you may need in order to be able to accept that power at that point. And then from there, you complete the project and it's interconnected. That is the ideal way that it works. If you go out onto PJM's website, they'll estimate that that takes a year and a half, 2 years, maybe. As you might guess, that has not been the case. Right now, the timeline for getting that process done is about 2 to 5 years, and depending on the RTO ISO. And that process comes with a bunch of complications that have risen to the forefront in the near term. That has been primarily the large influx of renewable projects that are trying to interconnect. So you have a bunch of smaller solar projects, onshore wind projects that are looking to come in. So that's just a larger volume of requests that the interconnection administrator needs to process. And on top of that, you have just a lot more uncertainty and changes happening around the pricing of those different network upgrades. As I mentioned, you all get grouped together into one, they usually call them clusters, for purposes of making that cost allocation. If the 3 of us are all in that cluster and for whatever reason Manisha needs to drop out, somebody still needs to cover her costs. So that just raised the cost for those who remain. And that can cause a domino effect that then further expands. End brief overview, maybe not so brief overview of the interconnection process. I had to tell you that story. Thank you. I had to tell you that story in order to contextualize what we're about to get into. So because of all of that uncertainty, particularly in PJM and those extending timelines, they sat down and said, we're going to change the way that we do this interconnection process. We're going to change some of the rules in order to expedite things. One of the ways we're going to do that is to address what they considered speculative projects. They were concerned about a solar developer, a wind developer who, sure, they intend to build this project, but they were going to figure it out as they went along. They put in the interconnection request, and after the interconnection request was in, they'll figure out the financing, they'll secure their EPC contracts, they'll do whatever they need to do, which isn't an uncommon way of being able to develop a project. It requires a certain amount of risk, but doing that in that way led to a higher likelihood that you would have those projects dropping out, therefore increasing costs. The rules that they proposed to do that, and I should mention this interconnection process is resource and generator agnostic. It is not tailored for each individual generator, least of which offshore wind. So the rules that they proposed to address these speculative projects was to, at least in 2 instances is relevant to what we're talking about here, require site control or evidence of site control earlier on in the process, and to limit the ability to make changes to your interconnection request once it had been submitted. So bringing permitting back into the room. When we're talking about site control, if you are developing a small solar project on a couple acres, that's not difficult. You've made the easement or you've leased the land from whoever the landowner is. As Chris framed this, your lease is only permission to submit more paperwork. You have to go through the whole COP process. You need to go through various state processes in order to get permission to, never mind, secure the actual rights to build and develop your project. Because of the long timeline that the COP process takes, you need to submit these interconnection requests 6, 7 years before you're actually planning to produce power. So if PJM is applying this speculative project criteria to this, it looks like a speculative project, but that's because it's not accounting for the intricacies of offshore wind development specifically. Same goes for the changes to your interconnection request once it's been made. As I mentioned, this is 7-8 years before you're actually producing the project. Fortunately, we have technological advancement moving much faster than that in that time period. So when you may have put in that interconnection request, the largest turbine that you could have secured was 12 megawatts, and that's what you sized your project based on. Since then, we have 15 megawatt turbines that are commercially available with 18 megawatt turbines on the horizon. If you're developing this project and you're going to spend the money, that incremental cost to go to a larger turbine, you're going to see a return on that. So it makes sense to increase your the turbine size, thereby increasing the amount of capacity you need in order to interconnect your project. So both of these issues came up, fortunately, in the stakeholder process. That was before it reached the formal filing and decision-making process. But as part of that conversation, they made the observation that, look, we're working with BOEM to work through the specific NEPA analysis and requirements that we need to satisfy from a permitting perspective. But you need to acknowledge that we're not the same as all these other projects, both in terms of time scale and physical scale of our projects. And there needs to be the flexibility built in to accommodate that while also still accomplishing the policy goals that you are setting out to do. One of those issues was settled ahead of time. The change that was needed was filed with FERC, which has the ultimate authority on approving these types of changes by PJM. The other issue that it's called the material modification standard of needing to increase your turbine size. A similar situation could occur if, as part of the NEPA review, there is a decision that your cable cannot go through this certain waterway, therefore it can't connect to that point on land. Or you can do that with these other modifications. All of that is to satisfy the BOEM process and making sure that the federal side is appropriately considered. But that can require changes to your interconnection request and sometimes even your point of interconnection. And that can delay that interconnection process. So I point all that out just as a current practical example of where the permitting process flanges up with practical realities of doing these projects. And please don't misunderstand what I'm saying there as to be a failure of a federal effort or a state effort. It is just the necessary complexity associated with multiple layers of jurisdiction related to a single project. I'll just taking that as the current example, looking forward, former Commissioner Sudi and Kelly did a great job laying out that meshed transmission. I'm actually probably going to ask her for that diagram. That's a very good diagram. That is a process that New York State is implementing. The New England states are considering something along those lines. And it's, as Jigar Shah has advocated for, sort of the preferred approach. From a strictly policy perspective, it is probably a sensible way to look at the interconnection of projects. You have fewer onshore interconnection points, thereby limiting the amount of permitting and community disruption and waterway disruption that is associated with that. At the same time, you have the traditional approach that has been used up until this point is just a single radial interconnection. And acknowledging that that comes with more cost in some cases and limits the ability to capture some of those synergies, we're talking about developing these projects on a rather limited timescale. As you mentioned, we're building an industry together in real time. Just the US, just on the federal level, we have the 30 gigawatts by 2030 goal, 7 years away. You have states that have set RPS goals before that. And the way that they've been procuring projects in order to provide the certainty to developers to be able to build those projects, all of this interconnection, all of this permitting stuff is moving right now. And to throw uncertainty, to throw other changes into that process slows down those timelines and can hinder the achievement of those goals. Again, to be clear, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be moving towards a meshed system, but there needs to be a recognition of, if you want to achieve these goals in the short term, both on a federal and state level, we need to strike a balance of being able to allow developers to maintain the certainty and control that they need to develop the projects as they've outlined them to meet these timelines, while also allowing for that transition to what may be a more efficient way of interconnecting. So we have the meshed system, and that would be sort of connecting all of the offshore facilities to each other. There's also a more traditional backbone system where you basically just build a superhighway in the ocean and then connect the projects to the end of that. The reason those structures matter and the way in which they're done matter, not only from the tax perspective as Sudhi noted, but also from a federal regulatory perspective, is depending on where the electrons are flowing and how they are flowing, you could be, rather than just a generator, also a transmission operator. If you're a transmission operator, that comes with its own set of requirements and other, frankly, costs in order to be able to do that. So while there may be reliability and efficiency gains in doing that, there needs to be an understanding on the developer side, and if there's a separate transmission developer, that transmission developer side, to allocate the risk across the two. If I have, my offshore substation is mesh connected to another one and my line goes off, what rights do I have to use theirs? Because they still want to use 100% of theirs. So we need to come up with an allocation procedure to be able to figure out who gets to access and when. Those aren't impossible questions to figure out. We've figured out similar questions onshore, but having the maybe not certainty. There was a very good point made on the last panel. It's not necessarily certainty,
Predictability.
but just the predictability of knowing where that is going to do so that we can organize ourselves accordingly. That becomes the real meat of the matter, and being able to achieve the policy goals around developing offshore wind while acknowledging the practical realities. And, it's the laws of physics. They will not bend to our will in order to be able to connect these projects. So I'll stop there.
That's awesome. Yeah, ending on the laws of physics is good. I'm curious, actually, how many students do we still have hanging out with us here? Yeah, you all should just everything Josh said, you should be so excited. Oh my God, who's going to figure all this stuff out? That's you guys. There's like so much job security out here.
We're hiring.
Yeah, we're hiring. Yeah, it's hiring. It's a good time. There were Josh's remarks actually made me realize there are two key points I maybe coulda, woulda, shoulda underscored or emphasized if I had thought about it in the first instance. First, one of the other major benefits of the FAST 41 statutory process is that it actually requires by statute agencies to include project sponsors in the permitting timetable and the planning of, soup to nuts, what it's going to take to get a project authorized. That's really valuable when you start thinking about all of the intricacies that Josh just explained, because I'm willing to venture that dime to a dollar, even if a marine biologist at the National Marine Fisheries who's doing an essential fish habitat analysis for purposes of supporting the CUP is aware of all of this transmission stuff, that person isn't integrating that thinking into their timeline or into their timetable. They're not thinking about supply chains. They're not, right? They have a very structured statute and a set of regulations, and what they care about is essential fish habitat. But if their review takes 13 months longer than it was supposed to, all this other stuff unravels for the project. So again, we're building an industry as opposed to just chucking out widgets of permitting approvals. And then secondly, and actually very much to underscore the point I just made, the federal environmental review and authorization process was not designed to, and therefore just cannot keep up with the pace of technology let alone the speed of money. And that is a reality. And so the challenge for all of us is try to figure out how to make those pieces fit together and work together, because you do have to have the permits are there, notwithstanding Chris's home contractor. These permits and rules and authorizations are there for a reason, right? They are there to protect human health and the environment, to save the species, to balance equities. And so you can't just ignore them, but to the extent that they don't reflect the reality in which we live in, we have to figure out how to make that work. So on that laudatory note, I will ask.
Thank you. And I have a question for Josh. It's how does interconnection happen in vertically integrated markets like the rest of North Carolina outside of PJM territory?
So you have a very similar structure in terms of the interconnection process, the request, things like that, but it is handled by that vertically integrated utility rather than this sort of grouped or communal approach that you're seeing, ICE New England, NISO, and PJM. It's not exactly part of the question, but an interesting tweak to that is you also have single state RTOs and ISO. So NISO is an example. It becomes easier to figure that out because it's just interconnected to a single state. As an alternative example, in PJM, New Jersey used this process called the state agreement approach. It came out of Order 1000 at FERC. And it basically set up a structure whereby a state could approach PJM and say, we have this specific public policy goal that we want to achieve. Can you help us structure a procurement and procure the transmission needed to accomplish that goal? New Jersey was the first state to take advantage of that in PJM. And just this past October awarded that project that was a coordinated offshore transmission system to deliver, at that time, it was 7.5 gigawatts of offshore wind to New Jersey. While that procurement was going on, the state has extended its target to now 11 gigawatts, and they're going to need to figure that out. But that is to say that there is a structure for being able to do that. The reason I mention that here is because when you have that PJM, it covers, I believe, 11 states, all the way from New Jersey down to North Carolina and further west all the way to Ohio. Somebody in Ohio may be getting a benefit from this this new offshore wind generation coming into New Jersey, but not as much as somebody in coastal New Jersey. So the state agreement approach is structured in such a way that, yes, state, New Jersey in this case, we will procure this on your behalf, but it's your ratepayers in the state of New Jersey who are going to pay for it. And making sure that that's allocated, making sure that that's understood, making sure that all of that is permitted because it is now a state action going through this process is a novel and useful way to do that, but needs to be fully thought out.
Thank you. And Manisha, a question for you.
Yes, sir.
Can you provide examples of how the environmental review funds are distributed? What does it go towards?
Oh, yeah. No, thank you. That's a great question. So currently we are looking at a number of different things. First and foremost, the human capital, right? The bodies to actually do the surveys and the reviews and the reporting. That's a big chunk of it. And for everyone sort of level setting or base, most agencies generally, when we're doing the budgeting or planning for how much a resource would cost, how much a FTE or full-time equivalent, that's how they count people. Usually the ballpark that's used, a round number, is $150,000 per person, meaning that's their salary plus all their benefits and all of that. So resources one. Another thing that we're very keen on spending the money on are tools to help with not just the monitoring and the tracking of permitting and permitting requirements, but in the first instance, doing the surveys and the scientific and technical analyses necessary and required by some of the environmental statutes. So, for example, providing the money for GIS tracking or developing additional GIS layers. But more importantly, within the federal family, providing the capacity so that agencies are all using the same systems to talk to one another, so that if, as a project sponsor, you're asked by National Marine Fisheries for data and you provide it to them in a certain format, that the Fish and Wildlife Service, who is implementing the Endangered Species Act, but in a different capacity, can still use that same data that you, as a project sponsor, or the attorneys for project sponsor, or the consultants, whatever the case may be, that we're not duplicating efforts, right? We're looking for ways to make, at the end of the day, the hallmark of our mission for the Permitting Council is to really find effective and efficient ways to do federal permitting. So that's another thing, tools like that. We're also directly providing money to tribes to help tribes staff up to be able to engage in the review, so that they can be meaningful participants early enough, but also so that the tribal engagement doesn't turn out to be sort of an adverse thing that people are like, oh, it's going to take so long. Like, that's a terrible way to think about it. But the way to help address that is to make sure that the tribes are properly trained, resourced, staffed up. And then we are also providing money towards training for federal employees, as well as project sponsors, as well as stakeholder communities, as well as the tribes, just to help everyone understand all of the complexities and nuances we've been talking about here today. So I think those are like the 4 big things in a nutshell.
Thank you. I have one last question for both of you. There's been a lot of talk about permitting reform, and it's been going on for some time. What's on the top of your permitting reform wish list?
You want to go first?
I can't say I have anything specific in terms of this specific thing, lay it down, do it. An interesting thing that has been floated for me is backstop siting authority for FERC. It has been something that exists in a more narrow sense for onshore projects, in terms of being able to build transmission to access significant resources, typically renewable resources, across the country. And there's been conversations about extending that authority to be much more broad, and to allow for the development of possibly offshore wind coordinated transmission solutions. But anybody who's familiar with the FERC process for natural gas pipeline siting knows that that's a very contentious area for doing it. The main thing being that it provides FERC with eminent domain authority. So, not taking any position on how that should or shouldn't be implemented, I think that invites a bunch of interesting permitting questions around, we need this infrastructure built in order to access these resources, in order to accomplish these policy goals. But is that expansion of authority and approach always the right way to do it? Again, we're talking about something on a very important and defined timescale if we're going to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve. And to do so while still making sure that local stakeholders, tribes, everyone still feels like they have a seat at the table, I think is a tough needle to thread.
Yeah. I think my answer to that question is, rather than a specific thing, I would, my wish list, my dream would be that we stop at a legislative level trying to use process as a surrogate for policy. Every time that the permitting process is reformed as a veil or a rouge for a particular policy prerogative, what you end up doing is creating more lag and confusion in the federal process, because all of the career rank and file folks that will then have to implement that statute will have to set up whole new systems and processes, potentially issue new regulations or fix the regulations they have to address the new policy. All of that takes time, 2 to 3 years. You heard this morning, right? It's going to take a long time for those rules to work their way through. Meanwhile, we still haven't built anything. We're never going to get to 30 by 2030 if that's how we're playing this game. So I would love, I'm not saying there is not room for permitting reform and very real and needed tweaks to the process. Amongst those, a way to elevate issues and get resolution on decisions from a single policy decision maker, clearly identified by Congress, would be great. But I think that every time an arbitrary time limit is put into a statute and everybody has to scramble to recalibrate, it actually ends up taking longer to deliver. So.
Thank you. Please join me in an applause for speaker.
Thank you. And congratulations for making it through Manisha's horse latitudes part of the agenda. The official definition of that, which means what you will find in Wikipedia, is it's roughly 30-degree latitude characterized by sunny skies, calm winds, and very little precipitation. So we did have very little precipitation in here in the room at the time. We didn't see the sunny skies, but we did have calm winds. You know, the narrative on the IRA has been the incentives are great, but implementation is where the rubber hits the road. And I think we've seen with the last two sessions, there's a lot of rubber out there on that road. And I'm just glad we have a lot of really smart people thinking about that and a lot of really smart students who are going to be the soldiers doing the work.